He entered the forest, as he always had, bold, careless, and entirely unaware that the air around him had already started to change. There was no thunder, no scream, no grand orchestration of fate descending. Just the hum of wind through the branches, the chirp of birds silenced too quickly, and a string being drawn back, tight and trembling. By the time the sun began to dip behind the trees, King William II of England, known as William Rufus, would be sprawled on the forest floor, blood soaking the moss beneath him, and the fate of the English crown would be rewritten in silence. He was not the eldest son. He was not the beloved one. But William Rufus had something others lacked: timing and nerve. When William the Conqueror died in the year 1087, his lands were divided like the spoils of war. Normandy went to his eldest son, Robert Curthose. But England, powerful, wealthy, unstable, fell to William, not through succession, but through strategy. While Robert lingered in France, William dashed for the treasury, seized the crown, and had himself crowned before his brother could raise a finger. Coronations in those days were not ceremonial pageants. They were declarations of possession. And William, with gold in hand and soldiers at his back, made himself king. But a crown taken in haste is a crown worn uneasily. William never married, never fathered an heir, and never secured a legacy beyond fear and taxation. He drained the nobles with cruel levies, left church positions vacant to steal the income, and treated the clergy with contempt, mocking their authority, even in their most sacred halls. Rumors clung to him like fog whispers of his sexuality, his brutality, his disdain for faith. But he ruled, nonetheless, unchallenged and unloved. By the summer of the year 1100, the throne of England stood on a knife's edge, with no clear air and many eyes watching. Then came the hunt. It was the 2nd day of August, a Tuesday, and William had eaten well that morning. The New Forest, a cursed place, some said, for it had already claimed members of the royal family in earlier years, stretched out before him, full of stags, shade, and something darker. He rode out with a small party of nobles, including Walter Tyrrell, a French knight of skill and status, who had only recently been drawn to the king's court. Others scattered throughout the forest, chasing deer, chasing glory, chasing distraction. But William, it seems, had already been chosen by something none of them could see. What happened next was swift and brutal. A stag ran across the clearing. William raised his bow, and an arrow flew, but it was not his own. Another shaft, faster, sharper, found its mark. It struck him in the chest, near the heart, and with a soundless gasp he fell. He did not cry out. He did not call for help. He simply dropped, alone, bleeding into the grass. According to some, Tyrrell looked upon the fallen king, said nothing, turned his horse, and fled the forest like a man running from a ghost. Others claimed he was never there. Others still believed the shot was no accident at all. Back in the royal halls, Prince Henry, the youngest of the Conqueror's sons, was already moving. He had been in the forest that day too. Though far from the scene, upon hearing of his brother's death, he did not grieve. He rode, first to Winchester, where he seized the royal treasury, then to London, where he was crowned within 3 days. 3 days. In an age without phones, cars, or swift communication, Henry moved with a speed that some called decisive and others called suspicious. He even released a coronation charter immediately, a document undoing many of William's oppressive laws. Too quickly written, critics would later whisper, prepared in advance? Perhaps. And what of Tyrrell? He disappeared into France, never to return. insisting from across the channel that he had not been present, that he had not drawn the bow, that the stories were lies, yet his family would be favoured by Henry's court in the years to come. Coincidence reward, or hush money paid in titles and land. Clerics and chroniclers of the age scrambled to explain the death, but their pens betrayed them. Some said it was divine punishment that William had mocked the church one too many times, and God had answered with an arrow. Others claimed the king's own dreams had warned him, blood reaching the skies in his sleep. Monks arriving with letters predicting doom, all added after the fact. Of course, but they made for good stories, for convenient theology, for history cleansed by sanctimony. There were no investigations, no trial, no public mourning. The king's body was thrown onto a cart by peasants and dragged to Winchester Cathedral, blood dripping down the road like some red trail of regret. The nobles did not weep. The clergy did not pray, and the people did not care. He was buried quickly, without dignity, without absolution. His tomb mistaken. His bones later lost to time and war. And so a king died, not on a battlefield, not in his bed, but on the dirt of a cursed forest, struck by an arrow whose origin remains a riddle 9 centuries later. Was it murder, accident, or something stranger? Was it Henry's ambition, Tyrole's carelessness, or God's wrath? Whatever the answer, one thing is certain: the moment that arrow flew, the kingdom shifted. A throne changed hands. A brother became a king, and history, as it always does, buried the truth beneath crowns, stone, and silence. Long before the arrow flew, before the forest quieted and the blood soaked the ground, there was already something broken at the centre of the crown, not just in the metal or the monarchy, but in the man who wore it. William Rufus had come into the world not as a chosen heir, but as an afterthought, the third son of William the Conqueror and Matilda of Flanders, born sometime around the year 1060, in a time when titles were still taken by sword rather than sealed by law, when legitimacy meant little if one had ambition, and when even the church had to kneel before the louder voice of power. In such a world, a second or third son could still dream of thrones, so long as they moved quickly, played ruthlessly, and understood that the line between inheritance and theft was nothing more than the time it took to draw a blade. William the Conqueror had intended for his eldest son, Robert Curthose, to inherit Normandy. That much was clear. But England, that foreign land conquered by blood and fire, was not something he had truly known how to pass on. And when the great conqueror finally lay dying, in the year 1087, there was no single, sacred will to ensure a smooth transition. Instead, there was confusion, distrust, and opportunity. And William Rufus seized all three. Before Robert could even leave France, the younger William had raced to England, taken hold of the royal treasury, bought the support of key barons, charmed and bribed the church, and had himself crowned King of England with speed that left his older brother stunned and powerless. It was not grace that gave him the crown, nor love, nor law. It was force, gold, and timing. From the moment he wore the crown, William ruled with the tension of a man who knew it was never meant to rest on his head. He began his reign with generous promises and public gestures, handing out land and money to those who would defend his claim, flattering the bishops, making donations to abbeys, and presenting himself as the legitimate son of a legitimate monarch. But underneath that initial charm, something darker began to stir. His rule hardened, his generosity twisted into extortion. He taxed the nobles into bitterness and drained the church of its wealth, with such audacity that even pious men whispered that England was being sold off piece by piece. To some, he was cunning. To others, he was corrupt. But to the clergy, who chronicled much of what we now remember, he was a man walking straight into hell, dragging a crown behind him. He had no wife, Not children. No heir to name. That alone set him apart in a time when kings were expected to build dynasties like fortresses. Whispers soon followed that he disdained women, that he kept no mistresses, that he surrounded himself instead with handsome young men who bore no titles but enjoyed strange favour at court. Some hinted that he was uninterested in women entirely, others that he simply had no time for legacy, only power. In a time when the church condemned sodomy as a sin so vile, it called for eternal damnation. Such rumours were more than scandal. They were seen as divine provocation, and William, whether guilty of the acts or not, gave little effort to silence the whispers. Instead, he walked through churches like they were markets, mocked priests to their faces, and held court on Sundays with such disregard for sacred customs that some bishops declared the king a curse in human form, yet William did not fear their words. He ruled with the confidence of a man untouchable, and for a time, he was. He kept the throne against uprisings, outmaneuvered Norman lords who favoured Robert, and outpaced any attempt by his younger brother Henry to rise. He was a warrior in his own right, known for riding into battle, with a temper as red as his name. They called him Rufus the Red, not for his hair, which was said to be blonde, but for the colour of his skin when angered, for the heat in his voice when insulted, for the flush of wine and wrath that marked so many of his dealings. He was not beloved, but he was feared. And for a king in those days, that was often enough. But time wears down even the fiercest men, and by the year 1100, the cracks beneath the crown were widening. Robert, though older, had gone off to the Holy Land on crusade, still dreaming of glory, and still burning from the loss of England. Henry, ever the observer, lingered nearby, not strong enough to take the throne by force, not bold enough to betray, but waiting, always waiting. William had no reason to fear them. He had outlived rebellions, laughed in the face of curses, and dismissed warnings like smoke in the wind. So when the summer arrived, and a hunt was proposed in the New Forest, the king did not hesitate. The forest was a royal playground, a place of sport and escape. It had taken his relatives before Richard, a younger brother, had died there. But William was not the kind to see omens in trees or ghosts in leaves. He gathered his court, summoned his companions, and rode into the woods, as if into a feast. The man who accompanied him, Walter Tyrrell, had recently arrived from France. Drawn by the king's generosity and rumoured favour, he was a skilled archer, well connected, and some say close to the king, in ways never recorded in ink, but whispered in firelit halls. There were others in the forest that day, scattered like leaves in search of game, but when the arrow struck, only Tyrrell was near enough to be named, and even that naming did not come from William's lips, for the king never spoke again. The arrow pierced his chest, perhaps from Tyrrell's bow, perhaps not, and the Red King fell, wordless, breathless, as though even in death he refused to confess. Those who wrote of him later would not mourn. Monks declared his death divine punishment, a righteous blow from heaven for a life of blasphemy and greed. Chroniclers laced their accounts with omens and portents, dreams of bleeding crosses, warnings from ghostly monks, stars that flickered before the fall. Whether any of it was true hardly mattered. The story was too perfect. A wicked king ignores the church, mocks the sacred, and dies alone in a cursed forest. What more proof did anyone need? Yet the reality, as it always is, was far messier. The man who should never have worn the crown had, in the end, paid the price not for taking it but for wearing it too boldly, too loudly, without apology or humility. His death left behind no child to carry his name, no widow to weep at his grave, no court loyal enough to defend his memory, and in the silence that followed, Another brother stepped forward. Henry, the youngest, the quiet one, the one who waited. But that is a story for another night. The New Forest did not begin as a forest, nor did it begin as new. It was carved into being by royal decree. Its creation marked not by growth, but by erasure. In the year 1079, William the Conqueror had declared this land a royal hunting ground, and to make space for the pleasure of kings, entire villages were cleared, churches were torn down, homes were burned, and those who had lived and died on the soil for generations were cast out into the wild with no name, no land, and no future. The law of the forest was unlike any other. It belonged to the king, and in it, only he could kill. And so the people whispered of curses, of blood sacrifices, of land that had once belonged to the saints, now claimed by men who worshipped only power. By the time William Rufus rode into the New Forest on that August morning in the year 1100, the trees had already seen too much. His younger brother Richard had died there, under strange circumstances, struck down by an arrow while hunting in the same woods. Another relative, Richard's nephew, would also perish in the forest years later, as if the land itself refused to forget the royal lineage that had tried to dominate it. It was not a wilderness that welcomed kings. It was a place that remembered. The sun was said to be bright that day, but the details blur with each retelling. Some say it was high noon when the arrow flew. Others claim it was late in the afternoon, when the golden light of dusk slanted through the branches like blades. The story shifts depending on who tells it. And yet one thing remains the same. The arrow struck fast, and the king made no sound. He did not cry out. He did not curse. He did not gasp. His body simply collapsed in silence, as if the forest itself had absorbed the final breath before it could escape. Walter Tyrrell, the man most often named, was said to be nearby, perhaps directly beside the king. Some accounts claim they were alone. Others that there were a handful of witnesses who saw the moment unfold but could do nothing. Still others suggest that Tyrrell loosed the fatal arrow while aiming at a stag, that it ricocheted off a tree or glanced off bone before entering the king's chest. But then again, others whisper that the aim had been too perfect, the opportunity too convenient, the silence afterward too rehearsed. Tyrrell did not stay to explain. He fled the forest at once, galloping his horse toward the coast and vanishing into the mists of France. There, across the channel, he would live the rest of his life, insisting upon his innocence, claiming that he had not even been in the part of the woods where the king fell. He swore he had not loosed the arrow, that he had nothing to gain and everything to lose. And perhaps he was telling the truth. But it is difficult to trust the words of a man who runs before the body is cold. The forest, however, had no need to explain. Its silence was ancient, patient, and fast. It had seen kings rise and fall, had held the blood of peasants and lords in the same soil, and it kept no record but the ones etched into bark and stone. No historian could capture the way the wind moved through the trees that day. No monk could describe how the animals paused, or how the ground drank in the king's blood without hesitation. These things belonged to the forest alone. In the days that followed, no one returned to the place where William fell. There was no shrine, no marker, no holy procession. His body was left where it dropped for hours before local peasants were ordered to retrieve it. They wrapped the corpse in a rough cloth, threw it across a cart, and dragged it toward Winchester like an unwanted burden. Blood spilled along the road, staining the earth like a trail of regret. Those who passed it did not kneel, did not weep, did not pray. They turned away. And yet, even then, the forest held the memory. For centuries afterward, people avoided the clearing where the Red King was struck. They said the grass would not grow there, that animals would not pass through, that a chill lingered even in summer. Some claimed to see him a flash of red through the trees, a shadow beneath the leaves, a rider who vanished when approached. Children were warned not to wander too deep, and those who did sometimes returned silent, pâles, and unable to explain what they had seen. Chroniclers attempted to make sense of the event. They spoke of divine judgment, of a king punished for his sins by the very land he ruled. They embellished the tale with omens, dreams of blood in the sky, monks with letters of warning, peasants who foresaw disaster and were ignored. But all these stories came later, shaped by men who needed the death to mean something more than chance. They wanted a lesson. The forest offered only silence. And then there were the others, those who believed it had been no accident. They pointed to Prince Henry's swift rise, to the way he rode directly to the treasury, claimed it before any rivals could speak, and had himself crowned within days. They noted how the coronation charter had already been prepared, how the man who had most to gain from William's death had been nearby, watching. Some even suggested that Tyrrell had been merely a tool, a hand holding the bow while another man whispered when to release. But again, the forest offered no answer. Its trees continued to grow, its birds to sing, its shadows to lengthen. The arrow was gone, the body buried, the witnesses scattered, and yet every crack of a twig, every rustle in the underbrush, every breeze that swept through those woods seemed to carry the echo of a single, unspoken question. Did the forest take the king, or did someone take the crown? Time passed, and memories faded. But the new forest remained. It is still there now. Older, quieter, but still watching. You can walk the paths. I feel the air grow heavy. I see the sunlight flicker, as if something unseen moves between the trees. You may not hear a voice or see a ghost, but if you listen closely, you might catch the whisper of an arrow, not just the one that killed a king, but the one that changed everything and vanished before anyone could say why. And so the forest waits, as it always has, with secrets buried beneath roots, and truth hidden in shadows. Before the hunt, before the blood, before the forest swallowed a king whole, there came a dream, not just one, but many drifting like fog through abbeys and bedchambers, unsettling the sleep of monks, knights, and perhaps even the king himself. These were no ordinary dreams, the kind forgotten with the morning bell. These dreams clung to waking minds, filled with blood, fire, and divine wrath. And though they were dismissed by some as nonsense, or as the inventions of men looking backward in search of warning signs, they would come to define the story as much as the arrow ever did. The first dream belonged to the king. The night before his death, William Rufus reportedly awoke in terror, his chest heaving, his brow soaked in sweat, calling for light and summoning his attendants. He claimed to have dreamed of being bled by a surgeon, and as the crimson stream flowed from his body, it did not fall, but rose arcing skyward, touching the heavens, darkening the sun. He called out to the Virgin Mary in panic, demanding the light be restored, and when it was, he refused to be left alone again. His men stayed with him until morning, watching as the dawn crept into the room, unsure whether they had witnessed a king unraveling or a prophecy unfolding. Others dreamed too. A foreign monk, unnamed in some chronicles but said to have been staying nearby, approached one of William's nobles in the early hours with his own tale. In his dream, the king had entered a church with his usual arrogance, snarling at the clergy, and in a fit of blasphemy, seized a crucifix and attempted to tear it apart. The statue endured the assault in silence at first, but then, in a sudden divine burst of fury, it kicked the king squarely in the chest, knocking him to the ground. From William's mouth, the monk claimed, issued flames, so vast they scorched the sky, and smoke that rose in curling black pillars toward the stars. Robert Fitzhamon, the noble who heard the dream, was said to be disturbed enough to share it directly with the king. William, ever the skeptic, laughed loudly, cruelly, perhaps even nervously. He dismissed it as monastic superstition, joking that monks dreamed for money and should be paid in silver for their efforts. Yet despite his mockery, he hesitated. The story goes that he delayed the hunt that morning, pacing, brooding, as if some part of him buried beneath the wine and bravado had been shaken. Still, he went. They always do. The dreams may well have been invented after the fact, but their presence in nearly every version of the tale cannot be ignored. Chroniclers like William of Malmesbury and Orderic Vitalis wrote them into the tapestry of events not as idle decoration but as central pieces of a divine puzzle. These were not mere coincidences in their eyes. They were signs, celestial warnings that a king was about to meet judgment, and that God himself had issued the verdict. The dreams transformed a bloody accident into a holy reckoning. They gave meaning to silence and purpose to chaos. But prophecy is a dangerous thing. It elevates the mundane into myth and masks the motives of men beneath layers of providence. For while monks scribbled visions and nobles whispered omens, one truth remained undeniable. The only arrow that mattered had been real, physical, loosed from a bow, and buried in royal flesh. And someone had to have drawn that string. Walter Tyrrell stood at the centre of that question like a statue in a storm, a French knight of respectable bloodlines and decent favour. He had arrived at court only recently, said to be invited by the king himself. He was not high enough in rank to challenge a prince, but not low enough to be invisible. That made him useful and expendable. According to the accounts that emerged after the king's death, Tyrrell had been hunting alongside William. Just the two of them in that fatal moment, the others scattered in the underbrush. William had supposedly wounded a stag, and as he followed its path with his eyes, shielding them from the sun with one hand, Tyrrell took aim at another. His arrow missed its mark, or so they said, ricocheted, and found the king's chest. William fell, Tyrrell fled. That is the version repeated in chronicle after chronicle, and yet its details crumble when examined closely. If Tyrrell and William were truly alone, then who recorded the scene so vividly? Who described the king shielding his eyes? Who saw the exact angle of the shot? The precise moment of collapse? Tyrrell himself could not have told it. He vanished that day, crossing the sea into France, where he would live out his life, denying involvement. Some chroniclers claimed he confessed, others said he insisted upon his innocence, swearing before abbots and lords that he had not even been near the king at the time of the incident. A few even said that another man, a knight named Ranulf, had been the true archer, a tenant of Tyrrell's, hired to do what needed doing without staining the family name. And then there was the letter. On the morning of the hunt, a monk from Gloucester reportedly sent a warning to the king, a letter filled with troubling visions, dreams of disaster, pleas for caution. The king read it aloud, laughing again, making light of superstition and fear. "Do what I told you," he supposedly said to Tyrrell, before mounting his horse and riding into the woods. What he meant by those words is lost to history. But for those who believe in plots, they have lingered like smoke. The dreams, the letter, the man who fled all of it, weaves a story too poetic to be coincidence, too dramatic to be trusted. Historians have long debated whether these elements were invented, retroactively added by churchmen, looking to frame the king's death as divine justice. But even if they were embellishments, they reveal how desperate those left behind were to assign meaning to what had happened. For in the end, that is what the dreams gave them, a sense of order, of judgment, of cosmic symmetry. The king had ruled without love, without piety, without legacy. He had defied the church, mocked its sacraments, and lived as though death could never touch him. To die suddenly, without confession, without an heir, and without warning, would have been an insult to the narrative the monks needed to write. But to die after a dream of bleeding into heaven, after a vision of being struck down by a crucifix, after a letter warning of doom, now that they could work with, that they could preach from pulpits and record in vellum as a lesson for future kings. Whether or not the king truly dreamed, whether or not the monk truly warned him, whether or not Tyrrell truly loosed the arrow, the story took root. And like all good stories, it grew. The dream became prophecy. The letter became proof. The death became destiny. And William Rufus, the Red King, the king without heirs, the man who laughed too loudly and rode too quickly into the heart of a cursed forest, became more than a monarch. He became a cautionary tale. The arrow pierced not only flesh but myth. And out of that wound, legends flowed. He did not stay. That much all versions agree on. Whether he loosed the arrow himself or merely witnessed the body fall, Walter Tyrrell did what few dared to do. After royal blood was spilled, he ran. No solem prayer. No alarm raised. No loyalty expressed. The king lay dead on the mossy ground of the New Forest, pierced clean through the chest, and Tyrrell turned his horse, spurred it hard, and vanished into the trees. That decision, not the arrow, not the accident, not even the death itself would mark him forever. Walter Tyrrell, also called Tyrrell, or Tyrrell in the old records, was no common man. He was a knight of noble blood, the lord of Poix and Pontoise, married to a cousin of the de Clare family, a family that would rise high under the reign of the next king. He was educated, respected, skilled in hunting and warfare, and familiar enough with courtly life to be included in the royal retinue. He had not come to England as a stranger. He had come with favour. It is said that William Rufus himself had brought him over from France, drawn either by his skill with the bow or by a closer, more personal bond that the chroniclers only hint at in whispered speculation. Some saw him as a pawn, others as a blade in the hand of another. But whatever Walter Tyrrell truly was, friend, favourite, tool, traitor on the 2nd day of August in the year 1100, he became something else entirely, the man who did not look back. What he saw in that clearing, only he could ever know. The records are muddled, contradictory, and dripping with the ink of men who wrote not what they knew, but what they believed. One source said the arrow he shot was aimed at a deer, and that it glanced from the beast's back and turned, impossibly, into the king's chest. Another claimed the king stumbled into Tyrrell's line of fire, a tragic accident born of poor timing and cursed luck. Others whispered that Tyrrell was the only one with William in that fatal moment, and if that were true, then every detail we know must have come either from Tyrrell himself or from no one at all. There were no trials, no interrogations, no royal inquests, no search party rode after him, no warrant was issued. It was as if the very silence of the forest extended into the court itself, swallowing the truth before it could take shape. And Tyrrell, sensing that silence, rode faster. He did not return to his estate. He did not wait to speak with the nobles who had hunted nearby. He did not defend himself. He crossed the channel to France as swiftly as a guilty man, or a terrified one, or both. Years later, he would deny everything. The most credible denial came from Suger, the abbot of Saint-Denis, a powerful figure in France, who claimed to have spoken with Tyrrell many times. Suger insisted that Tyrrell swore, again and again, that he had not fired the arrow, that he had not even been near the king in the moment of death. And Suger believed him. Why would a man in France, safe from English justice, lie when he had nothing to fear? But fear does not end at borders. To kill a king, even by accident, is to earn the hatred of history. A crown is not a mere ornament of gold. It is a symbol, a force, a holy weight. And to be the man who cracked it even unintentionally is to carry a mark no ocean can wash away. Tyrrell may have run to save his life, but in doing so, he damned his name. In the years that followed, his family rose quietly. The Clares, into which he had married, grew powerful under King Henry I, William's brother, the man who claimed the throne within 4 days of the Red King's death. This fact did not go unnoticed by those who believed in plots. They connected the dots with suspicion, arguing that Tyrrell had been protected by the new king, that his silence was purchased, that his escape had been orchestrated by those who wanted him gone before questions could be asked. After all, what easier way to silence a witness than to let him flee? Yet there are reasons to doubt even this, for if Henry had truly conspired to remove his brother, why would he leave behind a man so intimately connected to the scene? Would it not have been easier to ensure that Walter Tyrrell died in the forest too? A tragic double accident blamed on a rogue stag or a misfired bow. And if Tyrrell had been a willing assassin, why flee at all? Why not stay and declare it had been an accident, as others would have gladly echoed his flight? In the eyes of some, became not proof of guilt, but of chaos, the panic of a man caught in a moment too big to survive. And so Tyrrell lived out his days across the sea, his name written into English history, not for any deed of valour or treason, but for the singular act of turning away from a fallen king and choosing to ride. But history does not easily forgive those who run. The chroniclers, especially the ecclesiastical ones, rarely missed the chance to remind readers of his role. In their eyes, he was the archer, the sinner, the coward. In some accounts, his name is attached to the killing without hesitation. In others, his presence is described as unfortunate. A coincidence? But always, he is there just off to the side of the king's final breath. Just far enough away to escape. Just close enough to be remembered. And perhaps that is the truest punishment of all, for though the forests of France might have offered him sanctuary, and though the halls of Saint-Denis might have believed his innocence, Walter Tyrrell would never again be merely a knight. He became a figure, half shadow, half fact, the man who ran, the man whose arrow might have ended a reign, the man whose silence spoke louder than any confession. The arrow is gone. The king is buried. The witnesses are dust. But Tyrrell remains. In every retelling, in every theory, in every long, dark walk through the New Forest when the wind rustles the leaves and the old clearing seems too still, they say you can still hear hooves galloping through the trees, not fast enough to outrun guilt, not slow enough to be caught, just a constant, eternal flight. A man forever running from something he may or may not have done. A man fleeing not only the forest but the weight of the crown that fell behind him. He did not wait for the news to settle. He did not mourn, did not pause, did not stare into the trees where his brother's blood had sunk into the roots of the cursed forest. Prince Henry, the youngest son of William the Conqueror, heard that the king was dead, and he moved, while others stood stunned or scattered, while the peasants carted the body back to Winchester like a carcass unworthy of ceremony, while the nobles whispered and looked to one another for instruction. Henry already knew what had to be done. He turned his horse and rode. Fast, hard, without apology, as though he had been waiting his entire life for the moment the crown would fall, and no one would yet have the courage to bend and pick it up. The ride from the New Forest to Winchester was not short, nor was it easy. The roads were treacherous, winding through fields and low hills, past churches, whose bells still rang for a king not yet buried. But Henry rode like a man who knew the way by instinct, a prince not mourning a brother, but chasing a throne. When he reached the treasury, the heart of royal power, he did not hesitate. Entered, claimed it, seized, what was his, or what he believed was his, and did so before anyone else could even organize their grief into action. Robert, the eldest brother, was still returning from the Crusades. Far away in lands soaked with the blood of other kings, Walter Tyrrell had fled into France, leaving behind questions and silence. There was no heir, nor wife, nor child, no anchor to hold the throne in place. It teetered in the air. Suspended for only a breath, Henry reached out and took it. 3 days after William's death. Not 4. Not 7. But 3. Henry was crowned at Westminster Abbey. It was the 5th of August in the year 1100. And already the blood on the forest floor had begun to dry. The moss to reclaim its ground. The arrow to disappear into the thick dust of confusion. There were those who raised their eyebrows at the speed. Those who whispered that the coronation charter he issued that very day could not possibly have been written so quickly, unless it had been prepared in advance. Waiting in a drawer, penned by a man who knew or hoped that his brother's death was coming. The charter was short, just 14 promises, reversing many of the unpopular laws that had defined William Rufus's reign. It promised fairer taxation, the end of forced marriages for noble heiresses, reforms to church appointments, and restoration of lands unjustly taken. It was everything the barons and bishops had longed to hear, and they rallied behind it. With each clause, Henry's crown sat more firmly on his head. He positioned himself not only as the rightful successor, but as the antidote to his brother's tyranny. And yet, beneath the ink, beneath the seals and Latin phrases, some saw something else. The shadow of a plan carried out too perfectly, too quickly, too cleanly. Did Henry know? Had he plotted? Was there a meeting? A whisper? A glance between brothers in the weeks before? A recognition that only one of them could wear the crown? And that the forest offered an answer no court would ever need to confirm? There is no evidence, no letter, no confession, no servant hiding behind a tapestry who later emerged to speak of poisoned words or traitorous pacts. The chroniclers of the time do not accuse Henry directly. Even the most scandalous accounts stop short of naming him as the mastermind. But what they do mention, again and again, is the speed, that unbearable, undeniable speed. Kings do not rise in hours unless they are prepared. Coronations do not right themselves. Royal treasuries do not open their doors to just any claimant. Yet Henry, youngest of the brothers, barely 30 years old, ascended as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And England accepted it, whether out of relief, fear, or exhaustion. The barons gave their oaths. The bishops anointed his head with oil, and the people called him king. Some would later claim that he rewarded the de Clare family Tyrrell's in-laws with land and influence, that he sheltered those closest to the incident, that he bought silence, not with coin but with elevation. Others would say that was nothing more than the usual play of court politics, that noble families rise and fall with every reign, and that no one ever rose without stepping on someone else's grave. Still, the question remained, if Henry had loved his brother, would he have moved so quickly? If he had feared scandal, would he not have at least performed a better pantomime of mourning? But Henry was not built for grief. He had watched from the sidelines for too long. He had seen Robert flounder in Normandy, had watched William alienate the clergy and bleed the nobility dry. He knew that if he waited, Robert might return and claim the crown by right of seniority. If he hesitated, the barons might turn to another candidate. If he grieved, someone else might rule. And so he rode. The ride from Winchester to London was just as relentless as the first. He barely stopped. Horses were changed at way stations. Messages were sent ahead. The city was prepared before he arrived. By the time he entered Westminster, the Archbishop had already been summoned. The altar was ready. The people gathered. The crown, the same one that had sat upon the head of his father, The great conqueror was waiting. It fit him well. He ruled for 35 years. He married, had children, built alliances, fought wars, imprisoned his brother Robert for decades. He was remembered as a strong king, clever, manipulative, careful with words, but ruthless indeed. His reign was not without blood, but it was stable, and England prospered beneath his hand. And yet, no matter how many castles he built, no matter how many reforms he passed, there was always that first day, the 2nd of August, the silent forest, the brother bleeding in the moss, and the prince who rode away too quickly to be called innocent. Perhaps he had not planned it. Perhaps fate simply opened a door. And Henry, ever the observer, simply walked through it. Or perhaps he knew, not in the way of villains, not with daggers and whispered orders, but in that quiet, terrible way of men who understand that sometimes all you must do is wait. Wait for your brother to anger the wrong knight. Wait for the arrow to fly. Wait for the silence. Then move before the echo fades. He never spoke of it. He never answered the rumours. He never punished Walter Tyrrell, nor summoned him back, nor even asked for a testimony, and in doing so, he left a silence greater than the one in the forest, a silence that has lasted for more than 900 years, echoing not through trees, but through books, histories, and minds that still wonder how fast is too fast, and when does readiness become guilt. The crown sat well on Henry's head, but some said it glinted red when the light struck it just right, as if stained by something no polishing could remove, the kind of red only brothers recognize and never speak of again. He was a king, and yet, when he fell, the earth received him with more grace than the men who had once bowed to his command. There was no royal cortege lined with solemn knights, no tolling of bells in cathedral towers echoing from town to town, no sacred vigil with wax candles held through the night. When William Rufus, the second king of Norman England, the son of a conqueror and brother of future kings, died with an arrow in his chest in the woods of the New Forest. His body was left for hours where it fell, cooling beneath the branches, watched only by the trees, the moss, and the silence. No nobleman stepped forward to claim him. No priest was summoned in haste. No official proclamation was made that the king was dead. The blood of a monarch darkened the forest floor, and for a time, it seemed as if the world had already forgotten him. It was not a knight who retrieved his remains. It was not a steward or a royal guard or even a loyal subject. It was a group of country peasants, local men, unknown to history, unnamed in the records, who were summoned, or perhaps compelled, to do what none of the king's inner circle would. They found his body sprawled awkwardly in the bracken. The shaft of the arrow snapped off. The wound blackened and final. There was no sign of prayer, no gesture of last rites. The king had died unshriven, without confession, without sacrament. And now his remains were to be carted like a hunted boar. They wrapped him in rough cloth, not fit for royalty, but likely the only thing they had, and laid him in a wooden cart. The journey to Winchester was long, not because of the miles, but because of the shame that clung to it. The cart jolted over stones and ruts. The cloth stained through quickly. Blood leaked from the body in steady drops, tracing a line down the road that no one would follow. Flies buzzed in the heat. The smell of death raw, metallic, and undeniable clung to the air. There were no crowds gathered along the route to mourn. No noble procession accompanied the cart. No heralds announced the king's passing. It was as though the kingdom itself had exhaled. Relieved and indifferent, William had ruled not with love, but with pressure. He had taxed the barons, insulted the clergy, and ruled a realm always on the edge of resentment. And now that he was gone, a few seemed eager to remember him. At Winchester, where kings were meant to be laid to rest with ceremony and reverence. The reception was no warmer. His body was taken to the cathedral, but not with the grandeur of a monarch returning home. Orderic Vitalis, a chronicler writing years later, described how the corpse was wrapped in what he called a mean covering and brought into the city like a wild boar pierced by hunters. The priests and monks met the cart, but not with hymns they came. He wrote, because respect for the royal dignity required it, not because they mourned the man. The clergy did not mask their contempt. William had treated them with scorn in life, and now, in death, they returned the favour. There was no attempt to cleanse his soul through prayer. No chorus of mercy for a man who had mocked the church and ignored its teachings. Theologians of the time argued openly that he did not deserve absolution, and so they denied him the rites that might have soothed the path into the next world. He was a reprobate. They declared, a man who had forfeited his place among the sanctified. The bishop presiding over the interment did so out of obligation, not reverence. The burial itself was hurried and quiet. William Rufus was interred within the tower of the cathedral, but even that would not last. 7 years after his burial in the year 1107, the tower collapsed. Some said it was poor construction, the inevitable consequence of age and stone, but others, especially those who had never forgiven him, claimed it was a final sign of divine wrath, that even the cathedral itself rejected him, that the earth beneath his grave had shifted, recoiled, and brought the building down upon his memory. William of Malmesbury, ever the recorder of both facts and rumours, noted the collapse but dismissed the superstitions. Still, he could not deny the symbolism. The king who had mocked God had been laid to rest in a house of worship, and that house had cracked and fallen. Whether one believed in judgment or coincidence, the image remained powerful, a dead king, unloved, buried in silence, and remembered not with tears, but with omens. Years passed, but peace never came to his remains. In the 16th century, during the time of Bishop Richard Fox, the bones of several kings buried at Winchester were disturbed. Mortuary chests were reshaped. Bones moved. Identities blurred. By the time antiquarians of the Elizabethan age arrived to catalogue the royal dead, they were no longer sure which grave truly held William Rufus. John Stowe, writing in 1592, claimed he lay beneath a flat marble slab in the choir. Others insisted he had been moved to a mortuary chest, placed alongside the bones of King Canute. By the 17th century, another tomb, coffin-shaped and medieval, was being pointed out as William's, despite no earlier mention of it. In time, even that tomb would be opened. In the year 1868, the body inside was not William Rufus. The skeleton was tall, at least 5 feet 11 inches, unusually so for the medieval period, and was accompanied by the regalia of a bishop. It was eventually identified as belonging to Henry of Blois, William's nephew, a clergyman, not a king. And so, William Rufus disappeared again, his final resting place unknown, his bones likely scattered between chests, boxes, and slabs, all jumbled by war, neglect, and time. He was a king, but his funeral was a whisper. He had reigned over England, but he was buried like a man whose name was already fading. He had built no legacy, fathered no heirs, and left behind no tombstone that could hold his memory. And perhaps that, more than the arrow or the silence or the shadows in the forest, is what sealed his fate. Not that he died, but that no one cared enough to remember how. When kings die, they are supposed to be mourned. Their bodies are supposed to be clothed in silk, laid in carved stone, sung into the afterlife by choirs, and anointed by men in gold-threaded robes. But William Rufus died in the dirt, and the men who knew him most fled faster than his spirit could rise. There was no queen to weep beside his grave, no child to carry on his name. No monument grand enough to outlast the whispers. Only a story. Only an arrow. Only the scent of blood in a forest that never forgot. Stone forgets. But people remember, or at least they try to. They point to slabs, chests, and fading inscriptions, and say, "Here, this is where he lies." But stones are silent, and names etched into them can fade or be moved or lie outright. So it was with William Rufus, the king who ruled without an heir and died without a prayer, a man laid into the ground with no weeping nation behind him, and no sacred promise that his rest would be peaceful. He had ruled from the throne of England, but his bones, like his memory, were destined to wander. The first place they buried him was in Winchester, that much everyone agrees upon. The cathedral there had long been the resting place of kings and saints, and even the most despised among them were still granted a place beneath its stone vaults. But unlike his father, the great William the Conqueror, whose grave at Caen was marked and honoured, or his brother Henry, who would eventually die far from England, but be carried back with care, William Rufus was buried in haste. The tower he was buried beneath would collapse just 7 years later, in the year 1107, and some said the fall was no accident, that the weight of sin had cursed the very stone above his corpse. For a time, there was a marker, a flat slab, simple, plain, lacking grandeur, described by John Stowe in the year 1592 as lying near the lectern in the choir of the cathedral. He called it William's Stone. But even he admitted that by his time, the bones beneath had already been moved, shifted during renovations, or confused with those of others. Stowe wrote, with the weary tone of a man who knew the dead could not protest their relocation. A king, once named, could be renamed. A grave, once opened, could be closed again with another man inside. By the 17th century, a new tomb was being pointed to a raised, coffin-shaped structure in the cathedral, carved in the medieval style, solemn and weighty. Pilgrims were told that this was where William Rufus rested. His name was spoken again. His legend revived as visitors passed the stone and whispered of arrows and curses. And yet that tomb, so long accepted, was a lie. In the year 1868, the tomb was opened. Inside, they found not the remains of a king, but those of a priest. The bones belonged to a tall man, standing at least 5 feet 11 inches, far taller than the short, thick-set frame described by chroniclers who had seen William in life. With the body were items unmistakably ecclesiastical robes, ornaments, the trappings of a bishop, not a warrior. Slowly, carefully, scholars began to piece together the truth. This was not William Rufus, but his nephew, Henry of Blois, Bishop of Winchester, who had died in the year 1171 and been honoured with a tomb suited to his rank. And so the king vanished again, not in battle, not in story, but in stone. Where then is he? Some say his bones were gathered into one of the 6 mortuary chests that still rest high above the cathedral floor, carved and decorated, filled not with a single soul, but with fragments, femurs and skulls, splinters of pelvis and ribs, all mixed together by time, war, and human carelessness. When Oliver Cromwell's forces stormed the cathedral in the year 1642, they shattered those chests, pulled down relics, and used the bones of kings as missiles to break stained glass. What remained was gathered again, stuffed back into the boxes, sealed, and placed out of reach. The names written on the chests: Canute, Emma, Edmund Ironside, and yes, William Rufus are now guesses, based on hope and habit, not certainty. It is possible, then, that parts of William Rufus lie within one of those chests, jumbled among the shattered bones of others who once wore crowns or held crosses. A fragment of femur, a tooth, a sliver of skull, pieces of a man who ruled a kingdom but could not keep his name anchored to a grave. Others believe the truth is even more uncertain, that his body, damaged by the collapse of the tower in 1107, was quietly moved without record, that the slab John Stowe once saw marked his second resting place, before the bones were taken up again during the 16th century renovations, that, in some quiet act of neglect or discomfort, his name was allowed to fade, his grave left blank, and his remains lost forever to the shuffling of history. A king whose deeds had divided the church and burdened the land, forgotten, not through conspiracy, but through something more human indifference. There is something haunting in that, not the violence of his death, not the mystery of the arrow, not the rumors of plots or prophecy, but the soft, slow erasure that followed. The way his name grew quiet, the way his tomb grew false, the way no one came to claim his memory as their own, and yet the legend clings. Visitors still pass through Winchester Cathedral, eyes drawn to the chests high on their pedestals, each one painted with faded coats of arms, and guarded by silence. They look up and wonder, is he in there? Is that where the Red King sleeps? Is that the end of the arrow's flight? No one knows. Not for certain. And perhaps that is fitting. William Rufus ruled in shadow, a man caught between legitimacy and seizure, between church and crown, between rumour and rule. His death was sudden, without witnesses, without confession, without legacy. His reign was unloved. His faith was doubted. His memory was judged. And now his bones are scattered. Perhaps he lies in pieces above the heads of tourists, mingled with those he would have called rivals. Perhaps he was buried under a stone that now bears no name, beneath the cold hush of a cathedral that once denied him absolution. Or perhaps the forest, in its own quiet way, reclaimed him. The truth is this: he does not rest in the tomb that bears his name. The tomb that wasn't his holds another man's peace. And William Rufus, the king who laughed at prophecy, who rode into the woods with wine in his belly and steel in his hand, who ruled a realm but never earned a realm's love, he remains somewhere between fact and fable. His grave as lost as the absolution he never asked for. There are kings who leave behind monuments carved from marble, cast in bronze, etched in the hearts of their people. There are kings whose deaths are mourned in candlelight, whose names echo in hymns, whose tombs become places of pilgrimage. There are kings who die slowly, publicly, surrounded by bishops and banners and bloodline. And then there is William Rufus, who left behind no weeping widow, no child to bear his name, no court who sang his virtues, and no shadow on the wall when the crown passed from one hand to another. He died in silence. In a forest that had already claimed his kin, there was no glory, no battle cry, no final speech, just the twang of a bowstring, the hush of leaves, the thud of a body, and then nothing. No last words, no witnesses, no closure, just a monarch collapsed in the bracken, the moss drinking in his blood like dew, and the rest of the world turning quickly toward the next chapter. And isn't that the strangest part, how fast it all moved? How swiftly the death of a king became the rise of another? How quickly the forest swallowed the story? How eagerly the clergy rewrote it into morality? And how easily the bones were misplaced, until no one could say for sure where the man now lay. It was as though he had never been there at all. A king without shadow. Perhaps it was because he ruled without love. His reign, though powerful, was built on tax and threat, not loyalty. He mocked the church, and the church remembered. He raised no family, forged no dynasty. And when he fell, no one scrambled to preserve the flicker of his legacy. No stained glass window was made in his image. No tower bears his name. No loyal knight rode after his killer. The silence after his death was louder than his life had ever been. And yet he was king. He sat the throne of England. He held the scepter. He passed laws. He waged wars. He commanded the fates of thousands. He reigned for over a decade. And still, when he died, it was not power that marked him, it was absence. An emptiness that settled into the air like fog and refused to lift. History remembers him, but not clearly. He is a blurred figure. Trailing rumours. Was he murdered? Was it an accident? Did a brother plan his fall? Did a knight take aim on purpose? Were there dreams? Letters? Warnings? Or were those embellishments sewn into the tapestry later? By men who needed the arrow to mean something more than poor luck? And who was Walter Tyrrell? If not the man who fired? And who was Henry? If not the man who watched? And who was William Rufus? If not the man who died? The questions are endless. But the answers, they sleep, tucked into lost chronicles, scattered bones, burned records. Our king fell, that much we know, and from that moment, a story began, not just about how he died, but about how we tell the stories of those who do not quite fit. Because William never did fit. He was not the beloved son. He was not the gallant king. He was not the holy ruler. He was not a builder of cathedrals, nor a hero of battles. He was not the father of future kings. He was something else rougher, stranger, redder, a man of contradictions, bold, quick, sharp-tongued, feared but not followed, crowned but not cherished. And so, when the arrow struck, it did not end a golden age. It ended a silence. No one was eager to break. There is something haunting about being forgotten, something colder than death itself. And perhaps that is why the forest remains so central to his legend. Because the trees remember, the earth remembers, and when the wind moves just right, it carries the sound of hooves, the sharp breath of surprise, the echo of a body falling, not because William was great, but because he was gone too fast, too quietly, and because no one stayed to watch. There is no great lesson in his story, no neat moral to sew at the hem, only the uneasy truth that power does not guarantee remembrance, and crowns do not ensure peace. He was a king. He died, and no one ever truly knew why. Perhaps the last thing William saw before the world darkened was the canopy above sunlight breaking through leaves, golden and warm, and for 1 second, he did not see the crown or the court or the chaos of politics. Perhaps he simply saw the sky, and perhaps, for once, it was enough. Sleep well now. Red King, whatever parts of you remain scattered in chests, buried in stone, whispered in trees, they are yours. You left no shadow, but your silence lingers, and in that silence, we still listen.